I've entitled the lesson this morning, They Followed Vanity and Became Vain. And that wording is found in 2 Kings chapter 17. The wording itself is actually found in 2 Kings chapter 17 and in verse 15, right in the middle of it. They followed vanity and became vain. The New King James says they followed idols and became idolaters. And I know some of you young people have studied the book of Ecclesiastes. Have they completed that study at this time? And Hank taught that in the auditorium class some time back, but a recurring word is the word vanity. That's the same word that is used here, by the way. The word vanity is the word havel. Havel means that which has no substance, that which is empty, that which is futile, that which is of no account. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, it's saying that if you just live for this world only, you're pursuing vanity. It's emptiness. It will not amount to anything. Idols were empty. Idols were vapid. Idols had no substance to them, but they followed that, and they became what they worshiped. Isn't that sad? But I want to start reading earlier, though I will tell you in advance I'm going to give some attention to that principle. They followed vanity and became vain. It is the assignment that our brother Devin and I have this month that we've accepted gladly to deal with the topic, and I could say we've conspired together in terms of ourselves and the elders, other elders, my fellow elders, to come up with the theme, Lessons from the Divided Kingdom. I said on the first Sunday, it's challenging. I know I'm speaking for Devin as well. It's challenging because you've got so much information. So many years of biblical history are covered, so many kings, 19 in Israel, 19 in Judah, plus wicked Athaliah, a total of 20 rulers. And so many kings, so few lesson opportunities. I chose two of those on this past Sunday, again 2 weeks ago. I was looking at a king of Israel, Israel's first king in this divided kingdom period, that is Jeroboam, and talked about his unauthorized religion that would pave the way for apostasy for the 200 years that the kingdom endured. That night I looked at a king of Judah, Solomon, and I talked about the principle of viewing oneself as a super Christian, that in spite of all the privileges and blessings and wisdom that Solomon had, that we see at the end of his life, 1 Kings chapter 11, his wives turned away his heart from following God. So for this morning, which will be my final contribution this month in the series, what I've decided to do is look at a chapter that's a summary chapter. And 2 Kings 17 is a summary chapter. This is the chapter that tells of the Assyrians taking Israel captive, destroying the capital, which was Samaria, and then the people going into captivity. Now we think of Babylonian captivity, that's going to be later. This chapter is talking about Assyrian captivity for the northern kingdom of Israel when it came to an end, although 2 verses in this section will also mention Judah, and that basically Judah's making the same mistakes and not learning the lesson, but Judah's story will continue with the period of Judah alone that follows that of the divided kingdom. Having said that, instead of just summarizing the passage, for our purpose, I'd like just to read the text together. And the part that I want to read is not the whole chapter. But in 2 Kings 17, I want to start reading in verse 5 and go through verse 23. So you're welcome to listen or read along as you prefer. 2 Kings 17, beginning with verse 5. Now the king of Assyria went throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria, carried Israel away to Assyria, placed them in Halah, and by the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. For so it was that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and they had feared other gods, and had walked in the statutes of the nations whom the Lord had cast out from before the children of Israel and of the kings of Israel, which they had made. Also the children of Israel secretly did against the Lord their God things that were not right, And they built for themselves high places in all their cities, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves sacred pillars and wooden images on every high hill and under every green tree. And there they burned incense on all the high places, as the nations had done before whom the Lord, as the nations had done, whom the Lord had carried away before them. And they did wickedly things to provoke the Lord to anger, for they served idols, of whom the Lord had said to them, you shall not do this thing. Verse 13. Yet the Lord testified against Israel and against Judah by all of his prophets, namely every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes according to all the law which I commanded your fathers and which I sent to you by my servants the prophets. Nevertheless, they would not hear, but stiffened their necks like the necks of their fathers who did not believe in the Lord their God. And they rejected his statutes and his covenant that he had made with their fathers, and his testimonies which he had testified against them. They followed idols and became idolaters, and went after the nations who were all around them, concerning whom the Lord had charged them that they should not do like them. So they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, made for themselves a molded image and 2 calves, made a wooden image, and worshipped all the host of heaven and served Baal. And they caused their sons and daughters to pass through the fire, practice witchcraft and soothsaying, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. Now verse 18. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah alone. And also Judah did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the statutes of Israel, which they made. And the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel and afflicted them and delivered them into the hand of the plunderers until he had cast them from his sight. For he tore Israel from the house of David, and they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. Therefore Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord and made them commit a great sin. For the children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. They did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had said by all his servants the prophets. So Israel was carried away from their own land into Assyria, as to this day. That means at the time of the writing. What you see here is a summary chapter. And what it's doing is it summarizes from the death of Solomon. It goes back and it mentions Jeroboam. It mentions the 2 calves. It mentions his sin that continued. But again, not to get hung up on dates, but to give us a feel for what we're looking at, Solomon died in the year 931 BC. The events of this chapter take place exactly 200 years later a little over 200 years later, in 722 BC. We could round it up and say 200 years. 722 is the date of Samaria's fall. And so what these verses that we've just read do is they summarize 200 years of biblical history. They summarize what you're reading about, in other words, from 1 Kings 11 all the way through 2 Kings 17. They're summarizing all of that, not to mention the prophets that fit in this period that are also referenced in this passage. But what I want to do is to take this summary and basically just make 3 points. Number 1 is their passion and their standard. When I say their passion, you can see, boy, there's a lot of zeal going on. It's on every high hill. It's under every green tree. And that part when it mentions from the watchtower to the fortified city, what that means, and again, that's a case where some knowledge of the biblical world helps. The watchtower would especially be in a more remote area, the desert area where you could see danger. The watchtower would especially be there. From the watchtower to the fortified city, that is from the lesser villages and more obscure places all the way to the fortress cities, is the concept of totality. Isaiah chapter 2 will say the land was full of idols, and he's talking about this same period of time. And so you just see their zeal for pursuing idolatry. But I said I want to consider, number one, their zeal and their standard. What was their standard for all of that? And we have two verses that point that out. Verse 8 says that they walked in the statutes of the nations whom the Lord cast out. And you see that reference again in verse 11 that says they burned incense on all the high places as the nations had done whom the Lord had carried away before them. Now, could I reference very quickly with you? We're going to come right back to 2 Kings 17. But look at how God had appealed to them in Leviticus chapter 18. In Leviticus, where they are encamped at Mount Sinai, they received the law, they received its commandments, they heard God speak the 10 commandments. And they had that, they had the other. God had entered into covenant relationship with them. But he looked ahead to the situation when they would be removed from the foothills of Mount Sinai, and they would be relocated into the promised land and take possession of the land of Canaan. Here's what he said about that point in time. In Leviticus 18, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I am Yahweh, I am the Lord your God. According to the doings of the land of Egypt, where you dwelt, you shall not do, and according to the doings of the land of Canaan, where I'm bringing you, you shall not do, nor shall you walk in their ordinances." What is verse 3 saying? Your conduct, your standard for conduct is not going to be Egypt where you just were. You're not to behave like them. You're not to do according to the doings of the land of Canaan where I'm taking you. You don't behave like the people where you are from or like those people where you're going. What does that leave? The next verse says, "You shall observe my judgments and keep my ordinances to walk in them. I am the Lord your God." So yes, there was zeal. Yes, there was enthusiasm. I mean, you couldn't go after idols more than they did. What was their standard in doing that? It wasn't God's standard. It wasn't his word. They forsook the covenant. And they were walking like the nations round about them. You know, in Egypt, I know this is hard to fathom, and you almost think you're reading a misprint when you read this, but do you know that in Egypt that there were 2,000 different deities that were accepted? Now, that doesn't mean everybody worshiped 2,000 deities. You probably had your favorite one. But there was a recognition of a multiplicity of gods. And in Canaan, again, many gods worshipped, especially Baal, Molech, the female counterpart, Ashtaroth, all of that. It was prevalent. It was everywhere. God knew that. And so in the 10 Commandments, he preempted that. You shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make unto thee any graven image. Instead, and he specifically said you don't do like the nations, but they did. You know, J.B. Phillips in his translation of the New Testament in Romans chapter 12, that we're very familiar with the command to not be conformed to the world. J.B. Phillips translates that expression, don't let the world squeeze you into its mold. There's pressure there. That's exactly what they did. They let the Canaanites squeeze them into that mold. That was their standard. But in the second place, we see in this summary chapter that God is gracious. And he didn't just say, well, okay, if they're going to be that way. He was patient. And he was long-suffering. We saw that in some of the parables that were discussed this past week. God's patience and giving more time, giving more exhortation. And so you look at verse 13 that the Lord testified against Israel. This is the work of the prophets. May I say, Devin is going to speak on Isaiah, the prophet, chapter 7 tonight. You might want to be reading that in preparation for that lesson for 5 this evening. But Isaiah, all the prophets that fit in this period are under consideration. Turn from your evil ways. And again, the latter part of verse 13, which I sent to you by my servants, the prophets. And so God loves his people. And he sent men, he sent his servants time and time again, some of whom were shamefully treated. And they were not respected as a whole. Verse 14 tells the response that nevertheless they would not hear. And this is also a figure taken from their agricultural background, the setting of the biblical world, when it says they stiffen their necks. I mean, that may not mean as much to us unless, well, got a crick in my neck or something. But this is a figure of speech that literally has its connotation of an animal. You're trying to work with the animal. You're trying to get it to go a certain way. You're trying to get it to carry a burden, or you're wanting it to plow, and you want it to go this way. And so you indicate that, maybe prod it with a stick or with as you guide it with the yoke. And instead of being guided like the animal knows you're trying to get him to, it just stiffens that neck and won't respond. And so that expression, like stubborn as a mule, comes to mind. Where an animal is just, it's not that he doesn't understand what the master is wanting, he just stiffens his neck and won't respond. And so that was the response. In fact, that brings us to our key verse here. They followed idols and became idolaters. I did a comparison of some translations. The New American Standard says, and it's the same as the King James and American Standard, it says they followed vanity and became vain. Some of you have the Christian Standard. Also the NIV says they pursued worthless idols and became worthless. You think about that. They're worthless. What does that mean? Worthless to the Lord. Not living in keeping with His purpose. I don't want to just take up space. I want to accomplish God's purpose in my lifetime. They were worthless to the Lord. The ESV says they went after false idols and became false. And this is similar to Jeremiah 2 and verse 5. The prophet there later would say the same thing. They walked after emptiness and became empty. Hosea, that fits in this time, he was a prophet sent to Israel, and Hosea 9 and verse 10 says, Israel became as detestable as that which they loved. You see, it's an undeniable principle. We are reflective beings. We're imitators. And we become like that which we worship. Now that can be a good thing. Luke 6 and verse 40 says, the disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone when he's been fully trained will be as his teacher. What does that mean? You admire the Lord. You love Him. You worship Him. The result is, as Paul said in Romans 8, 28 and 29, that we be conformed to the image of God's Son. Colossians 3 is similar when Paul says if you were raised with Christ, he's already talked about being buried with Christ, but if you're raised with Christ, you have that mindset. You're seeking the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. He goes on down, you died, your life is hidden with Christ. He goes on to say, Christ is all. See, that's what happens as Ephesians 2 and verse 1 begins, you're imitators of God and walk as beloved children. Or as Paul would say in 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 18, but we all with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into that same image from glory to glory. That's what happens when you admire the Lord, when you reverence Him. We resemble what we reverence. We become what we worship. But that's not a selective trait. Walk with wise men and you'll be wise, but the companion of fools will smart for it. Evil companionships corrupt good morals. It works the other way too. And if you follow vanity, it's not, well, no harm done there. You become vain. If you follow what is worthless, then you become worthless. This is a point developed. I didn't know how much of Psalm 135 that Brother Pender was going to read this morning, but that becomes developed in that psalm. Psalm 135, may I go on down to verse 15? The idols of the nations are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they do not speak. Eyes they have, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear, nor is there any breath in their mouth. Those who make them are like them. Verse 18, so is everyone who trusts in them. Here they are worshiping an image that has eyes, but those eyes can't see. It has ears carved there, big, sometimes like with Hathor, the Egyptian goddess, big ears. They're actually the ears of a cow, as human and animal features are often combined as people worship and serve the creature as well. And they have ears, but they can't hear. They have a mouth, but it doesn't speak anything. When Isaiah received the prophetic call in Isaiah chapter 6, and the Lord said, "Whom shall I send? Who shall go for me?" Isaiah said, "Here am I, send me." God says, "I'm going to send you to a people that have eyes, but they don't see, ears, but they won't hear, a mouth that won't speak, and a heart that doesn't understand." What has happened? The people had become like the idols that they worshiped. And that very wording is repeated a number of times, including in the New Testament by Jesus himself in describing those of his day. It's undeniable. We become what they worship. And they worship vanity, and they became vain. They worshiped that which was futile and empty, and they became likewise futile, empty, and worthless. Our third and final point is that when God's warning is rejected, there comes a time of reckoning. What have we said? First point, we looked at their passion and their standard. Secondly, we looked at God's grace as he warned through his prophets. The third place, we see God judges. We see that time of reckoning comes, and it starts out with the word therefore in verse 18. Therefore. So what has happened is already punitive measures have been taken. Again, when I mention information, I want it to be helpful and not something you say, well, I don't need that. But 10 years before, in 732 BC, the king before, the king that started the siege, his name was Tiglath-Pileser, he's mentioned in the scripture, and he had taken all of Galilee to the north, and he had taken all of the eastern territory east of the Jordan. That was 10 years earlier. But instead of learning from that, they had continued. So now, this time of reckoning, as the text says, God is allowing the Assyrians to take the people captive at this time. But you know, but he doesn't say it's just something that happened then, as verse 21-22 points out. He's tracing this apostasy all the way back to where we started in lesson number 1, that is with Jeroboam and his apostate worship. A lot of times people today say, it doesn't matter how you worship, just so you worship God. Try telling that to these prophets. Try telling that to the people that are at this time in a lost condition, because that's what they thought. God has never said, just so you worship me, it'll be okay. He's always given revelation as to how he must be approached. And that's another lesson. But they had ignored that. And they'd followed in what made them feel good, what they wanted to do. And look where it got them. But what I want to stress as we conclude this section is something that's very sad. And that is 3 times, and I've underscored it in my Bible. In verse 18, the Lord removed them, right in the middle of it, remove them from his sight. And it's at the end of verse 20 where you have, until he had cast them from his sight. And verse 23, until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight. Now I know it would be bad to be taken into Assyrian captivity, to be uprooted from your home, to have a hook in your nose and a bridle in your lips, your clothes stripped, and you walking hundreds of miles and being displaced to another country in Mesopotamia. That would be bad. But that's not as bad as the real principle we're talking about here, when 3 times it says they were taken out of his sight. A lot of things when we read about the destruction, the punishment of hell, to me are so awful. Outer darkness, weeping and gnashing of teeth, a furnace of fire that cannot be quenched. But do you know, to me, the most terrible thing is said in 2 Thessalonians 1, when it says in verse 7 and following, of those that know not God and obey not the gospel, they'll be punished with eternal destruction away from the Lord and from the presence of His might. Eternal separation from God for people that have said, I don't want God in my life. I don't want God to tell me what to do. And God basically says, okay, you can have it. He doesn't want that. Jesus died that we would not be in that situation. God doesn't want any to perish, but that all should come to repentance, 2 Peter 3 and verse 9. But if a person is determined to live it his own way and ignore what God has said, God will sadly say, thy will be done. We don't know how bad that is, because in this life the most stubborn and rebellious person is surrounded by the goodness of God. There is salt on this earth. There are lights in this world. And it's impossible to know how dark it would be without that. How agonizing it would be without God's presence being manifested. But that is what hell is all about. And when I look at this, I think, well, Assyrian captivity is bad, but that part God said, okay, I want these people out of my sight. Kind of like in Romans chapter 1 and 3 times in that passage, when it talks about those that refuse to have God in their knowledge, worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. It reminds me of Psalm 106 and verse 20 that says that they exchanged the glory of God for the image of an ox that eats grass. And the text says 3 times, wherefore God gave them up. Now, I don't want that, and God doesn't want that. And instead of those sad words being said of us, thanks be to God, we said this morning, trust and obey. As Bill said, God sent His Son. Jesus paid a debt we could never pay. He paid it all. And He doesn't want any to perish, as we've said. His grace and His mercy has brought salvation down. And so as we conclude 2 Samuel 17, boy, there are lessons to be learned, aren't there? Our standard and our passion must be for the things of God. And we must respond to what God has said through His messengers. And realize that there will be punishment on those who reject and stiffen their necks against God. God wants us to come. All things are ready. Come to the feast as we stand and sing.